like this, man. He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down in the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all time.
All right, Josh Neal, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Doing well. Long-time listener, first-time guest. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man, I'm really glad to have you on. As you know, I extended you an invite a while ago under different circumstances, and now that it finally makes sense, I'm really glad to have you on, man. It's funny, no details, of course. You and I met, face to face. And I had read your book, but had no idea who you were. And so it was a very funny realization. A few weeks later, there was like, wait, that's the same guy?
Yeah.
Yeah, which is just a failure on my part. But yeah, man, I'm really excited to have you on.
Well, there's also a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde aspect to me too. So if you only know me through my writing and then you meet me, it's like, what? That jerk wrote that. I'm looking forward to talking to you today.
Yeah, sure thing, man. So obviously, you've been making the rounds on a couple shows recently, talking about an article you've written. And so, do you want to just provide, generally speaking, your background, who you are, before we launch into that?
Yeah. So. I'm a notoriously canceled person, so your audience can find me very easily. I'm a writer. I've written a few books for Imperium Press. I've got a new one coming out in the new year with Antelope Hill. Maybe your audience knows the books: American Extremist, Understanding Conspiracy Theories. I used to host Euro Bureau of Literatura, which was a philosophy book show with Tyler Hamilton and Jefferson Lee. I used to co-host the Jefferson Lee Show with Jefferson Lee. And I've been hanging around these parts since about 2017. So maybe some of your audience will know me, but I've been a pretty infrequent podcasting personality. So maybe this is the first time some of your audience is meeting me, in which case I'm sorry.
Yeah, man, I primarily, found, your and Jefferson's work really through the show y'all did together, which again, one of the many reasons I despise YouTube is that they've basically taken all of that down. That was really great content. But more recently, right, you sort of re-entered the arena with a really, really interesting piece about one of my favorite people in the world. So do you want to introduce that?
Yeah. So James Lindsay, who I guess he rose to some notoriety due to his work with Peter Boghossian, and they wrote some. I think the essay they wrote some years ago was The Metaphysical Penis or something to that effect.
Yeah. So it's funny. I spent some time up in the Pacific Northwest, and a bunch of the guys there who are now interested in our sort of politics were like, yeah, we know those guys. Like they were around. Obviously, Lindsay less. I think he was out of Tennessee, but Peter Boghossian was kind of infamous around Portland. And effectively, what they had done is they had this big, I guess, like stunt where the hoax they pulled was basically going to these kind of like third-rate, feminist studies, Black studies, the kind of like critical theory type journals, and then published, just absurd articles, right? The metaphysics of the penis was one. They had rape culture at the dog park. And the whole point was, we can get these, low rent journals to publish anything. This is not a scholarly discipline. And so, those guys were really catapulted into fame during the kind of IDW era, right? James Lindsay kind of split off, and, he really became famous for doing these kind of like long deep dives on French New Left thinkers. And to give him credit, his very early work is not bad, I think is what I can say of it. But as I and other people in kind of my age demographic kind of grew out of that. He kept going, and he's built this kind of conservative grift empire out of basically screaming that everything and anything is woke, and that the source of all of our social ills is basically a few crusty Marxists from the 1960s. But sorry, Josh, I was stepping all over you there.
No, I appreciate the context. I remembered the metaphysics of the metaphysical penis in my like sort of normie days, 2016, whatever. And I thought that was funny at the time. You know, I didn't have a radical or identitarian or nationalist worldview at the time. So I was like, wow, they really pulled one over on those dumb liberals. But he's still, like you said, he's still up to the same thing. He published something with the American Reformer, which was, I think, even lamer than the metaphysical penis.
Well, see, here's the thing. I actually know those guys. I appeared on their podcast. I'm in group chats with them, and they're good guys, right? But it's not a major operation. It's like a couple guys part time, and so if you submit an article, you'll probably get it published. The big coup that Lindsay said he did was he used a pseudonym, right? Karl Marx. And, he rewrote a section of the Communist Manifesto. Pete had a very interesting take on it, which actually echoed what I did, which is Lindsay's point is, I proved that they were quote unquote woke because I used the Communist Manifesto. But to anyone else, it looked like someone who was deliberately aping the Communist Manifesto. Like it wasn't particularly close, but it seemed like, like if I started a sentence with 20 years ago, I'm not hiding the fact that I'm ripping off Abe Lincoln. I'm using it as a device. But anyway, sorry, back to you.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that you said that, because my first feeling when that hoax was unleashed on the internet was not that he had proven the American Reformer was woke, but that he had proven that if you're a journalist or an editor with a shoestring budget, that there's actually not a lot of time or eyeballs to like really, really meticulously pore over things. So it was like a real serious case of you're not proving what you think you're proving. But anyway, yeah, I wrote this essay not about the American Reformer or the metaphysical penis, but about Lindsay's crusade against the woke right. And he's been on this beat, I guess, for a few months, at least since September. And I think like most people, I just kind of hand waved it away as a silly smear from a conservative grifter. But James Lindsay is like a dog with a bone, and he's really not let this go. And he recently did an appearance with the Trigonometry guys. I guess they're both comedians. I don't actually know them. Konstantin Kisin and some other guy. And there was a snippet, I think this might have been around the time of Thanksgiving or earlier this month, where the excerpt was James Lindsay expounding on his definition of the woke right. So I watched it, and there was a light bulb eureka moment where I was like, oh, I get what he's trying to do. So I wrote out this essay, which is on my blog. It's also on unsreview.com. It's called "The Woke Right is the New Paranoid Style in American Politics." And so for your audience who maybe isn't familiar, the paranoid style in American politics is this famous essay written by Richard Hofstadter, who was a very prominent historian, died somewhat on the younger side, I think. But he published he won the Pulitzer Prize at least once for a book called The Age of Reform, which was him. Like I said, he was a historian, and the book was about the populist movements of the 19th century. He wrote about anti-intellectualism. He wrote about the gun culture in the United States. And then he wrote this he wrote this essay, which later was released as a book called The Paranoid Style in American Politics. The theme or the subject matter being, this was published in 1964. And he was writing about the John Birch Society. He was writing about Barry Goldwater. He was writing about McCarthyism. He was writing about what he called pseudo-conservatism. And he, Hofstadter had this interest in psychoanalysis. He had this interest in Frankfurt literature. In his youth, he was a Marxist, and he was actually, I believe, a member of the American Communist Party. And roughly around the time that Stalin took over and began the purges, like many intellectuals of a certain background, Richard Hofstadter pivoted away from communism into becoming sort of a liberal American patriot. And so my essay is trying to make this argument that Richard Hofstadter established this type of polemical argumentation, which really only works to establish a consensus for the government to operate from a policy perspective or even from a culture war perspective. And funnily enough, Richard Hofstadter actually had a reputation as belonging to this school of historical thought called consensus history. So he actually was, so in this clip in Trigonometry, James Lindsay is talking over and over and over again about how us kooky woke right people believe in this mysterious, spooky post-war consensus, when in fact there was a legitimate school of history in the United States of academic thought called consensus history. Now, I put a slightly different spin on the meaning of that phrase, but the point of the essay was to establish that the woke right is just like the paranoid style. It's this type of polemical argument which really is not academically rigorous. It doesn't have a lot of analytical value. In fact, it's composed mostly of logical fallacies. But because it's a type of argumentation that is, if you want to say, punching down or a top-down style of argumentation, it's something that the establishment or the regime or the system, whatever kind of word you want to use, uses to dismiss and delegitimize rival political groups, movements, parties, what have you. So someone like James Lindsay apparently has a vested interest in dismissing the, if you want to say, more nationalist side of the right wing, or the real conservatives, the real Christians, people who actually take tradition and conservatism and patriotism really, really seriously. So this whole woke right thing is a sort of polemic against honest right-wing people.
So there are several things there. The first of all, I should say, James Lindsay is connected to certain very litigious people. So everything I'm about to tell you is a lie, complete and total fabrication. Now that said, if you were to look into James Lindsay's funding, you would find some very, very interesting things, right? Particularly as regards to a certain Middle Eastern democracy, to kind of like the Chinese expat community. So you might be right. You might be. How many qualifiers can I put onto that sentence? One of the other things that I think is interesting, right, is this kind of like liberal facade of neutrality, right? The idea that, they cast themselves as these kind of like the objective center of history. And so the slur, right, woke, at one point in time, it could basically be considered to be like, a gay race communism, right? The kind of like combination of all those things put together in extreme social progressivism. But it very quickly became a slur, as you see in the phrase woke right, for not aligned with liberal policies, right? So if you dig into the kind of Lindsay sphere, you'll find all these like really insane graphs, right? Like one of my favorites, is this sort of like, it's the horseshoe, right? The horseshoe theory. And, on the extreme, far right, you have, a certain austere Austrian painter, you have Pinochet, kind of comes back, through more normalized politicians, the left, we get the socialists, the Democrats, Stalin. And then the farthest left you can get is the pharaohs of Egypt. Like it's basically like Nation of Islam level political analysis, right? It's completely bonkers. But, buried within that is the idea that the abject center of the world, right? The apex of history is, the liberalism of yesteryear. And I think it's really interesting to the point that you mentioned earlier, right? That it's basically just a slur, right? There is an argument appended to this, but effectively all of this is James Lindsay saying, I don't like you, go away, you are an enemy.
Yeah, and that's apparent in that. So I actually excerpted his entire definition of the woke right in the essay because I wanted to be fair, right? I'm not actually trying to just beat James Lindsay with a stick in the way that he's trying to beat us. I wanted to actually demonstrate in a rigorous way, what's wrong with the polemic, because there's room for polemicism. When there are things you don't like in the world, you write about it, hopefully to get rid of them or correct them or whatever the case may be. So it's not like polemics per se is an illegitimate style of argumentation. It's just that the type of argumentation that James Lindsay is doing is very bad and it's very wrong. So he's describing. One of the things he's doing, you referenced the horseshoe theory, is something that Richard Hofstadter did as well, which is identifying, characteristics and features and traits of the one end of the horseshoe that are supposedly identical to that on the other side of the horseshoe. And because you have these sort of obvious glaring similarities, that we can effectively dismiss any distinctions between the two groups, which is really fallacious. It would be like saying, and this is the argument, one of the arguments I present in the essay, it would be like saying like the Latin kings are identical to the LAPD because they both carry firearms and they both communicate on, they both use communications technology to organize, and they both have uniforms, and maybe they both are aggressive, macho people, right? And maybe they both use media to influence opinion about their constituencies, right? This is what Lindsay says about us relative to communists. Well, we both use social media to manipulate public opinion. We're both engaged in identity politics. We both do ad hominem arguments and things like that. And just because you can identify similarities doesn't mean that you can eliminate differences. And Richard Hofstadter also did this. So in his essay, The Paranoid Style, there's one section where he compares, for instance, the KKK to the Catholics. And he says, well, isn't it really, imagine, a chin stroking, eyebrow raised. Isn't it really interesting that the KKK hate the Catholics? But they also wear priestly uniforms and they also organize themselves in a hierarchy. Isn't it very interesting? Yeah, right. So their rivalry is actually illegitimate because they both wear long, flowy uniforms and they both have a hierarchy. Isn't that interesting? He compares the anti-communists like the John Birch Society to the actual communists. He says, isn't it interesting? They're both engaged in this zero-sum ideological war. It's almost like there's no difference between these two groups of people, when obviously there are. Because for one thing, if we just go back to the KKK and the Catholics as an example, and I'm not going to say anything dramatic here. Obviously, I'm not affirming the KKKs on the Jay Burden Show. But we're talking about two actually different groups of people. Like they're constituted by different types of people and they have different aims and they actually represent a different style of life. So even though you can point to things that are superficially very familiar, it doesn't eliminate the foundational differences between these two groups.
Well, Josh, I know you are a committed member of at least one of those two organizations. I'll leave it to my viewers to discern which. Well, and again, right, when we're making a classification, right, the whole point of creating a class is to make discussion easier, right? Like if you're, saying okay, well, we need some sort of box to put a number of concepts in, and that box is useful because they share certain features. But if the category grows too wide, as is the case with woke, it completely loses all function as a descriptor, right? Like if effectively the only thing that isn't woke is a very narrow band of relatively recent political history, then it's a stupid term, right? If Genghis Khan is woke and, a Swedish liberal Democrat, AOC, the same kind of austere Austrian painter I mentioned earlier, and then also the Romans are all woke. It's like, well, what does that term mean, right? It basically functions purely as a not liberal. And okay, fair enough. You can say that something is illiberal, right? But you fundamentally created an absolutely useful box for everyone else in the world and then patted yourself on the backs for putting them in that. It's stupid.
It's interesting to actually, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Maybe mostly because of the Trump victory in November, it's kind of given me this long view of the last 10 or 15 years. But I actually do, like Based, I actually remember when Based started. I remember when woke started. And there's probably people running around today using these words kind of not cognizant of their origination, right? Lil B was this rapper, I suppose, like an independent rapper, who did these like very low budget YouTube videos. And he would release these records online. It would be like 300 tracks of the same kind of production and same lyrical content. And he coined the phrase based. And then through some wacky cultural transmogrification, it got picked up via the internet, really, by the nationalists, or whatever you want to say, conservative people, the radical right, Trump people. And the similar thing with woke. It started as a sort of slang by American blacks as a kind of identifier, like, oh, he knows what's going on. Like, he's hip. He knows the score. If you say, oh, he woke, you're saying like, oh, he knows about, they wouldn't have said this, late 2000s, early 2010s. They wouldn't have said, oh, he knows about systemic racism. Oh, he woke. But they would have, it was kind of sort of like, oh, you're one of us. And it always had to do with certain kind of spooky conspiracy stuff, right? If you knew anything conspiratorial and you talked about it, oh, he woke. And then it became a pejorative during the Obama years, probably more specifically the second term of the Obama years. And now it's become this scapegoat. That's kind of like the trajectory of this phrase woke. It actually refers to a specific time in history. It has a very specific beginning. And while that meaning and application has changed since 2008 or 9, it has really only referred to a particular time in history, which is why it's kind of goofy. By the way, I'll pause and I have to ask, has James Lindsay actually said Genghis Khan is woke, or is that you being cute?
Well, he has said that the pharaohs of Egypt were woke, wow. At which point I feel like this is a meaningless distinction. It just applies to everything he doesn't like.
Yeah, that's crazy. Wow. That's really Tutankhamun was woke. That's really crazy. So yeah, and now it's become this convenient scapegoat, right? Trump has won. Woke people, there's enough people that are they have woke fatigue. And so now it's a scapegoat that elements of the political establishment can use to jettison people and movements and initiatives that are really not expedient anymore. And because woke is no longer as expedient, it can now be repurposed as a new it's given a new taxonomical utility by the establishment to slander people like us. So yeah, woke really only refers to the specifically Obama era kind of media cultural phase 2 of the civil rights revolution, if you want to say. I don't know if you agree with that definition, but that's how I think of it, right? And so in that framework, like, you can't say that a Jay Burden or a Paul Gottfried or a Saint Michael is woke. It just doesn't make any sense.
Well, exactly, right? And I think one of the interesting things about what Lindsay has also done, right, is that obviously his kind of foray into the woke right has not gone well for him. He's basically just getting beaten pillar to post by everyone he interacts with. Right? It's very clear that, even to people who aren't necessarily plugged in, that this is simply a bullying tactic. Right? He's just trying to get rid of people he doesn't like, shut them out of the discussion. Actually, which is an interesting point, because doesn't that exact same thing form part of his definition of woke? Right? The idea of centering your group's interest in power politics, which I guess is an interesting aside. But even right in his earlier work, when he cataloged the New Left, it's also interesting that he views that as the exclusive genesis of all problems with society, because James Lindsay has this weird sort of bibliography brain, right, where he creates these like genuinely schizophrenic leaps in logic, right, which is now his big thing is, what does he call it? Hegelian pantheism, right, where he's basically developed this schizo theory that every problem with the world is downstream of Hegel, right? And it's secretly all of these people are Hegelians, or they've gotten their ideas from people who got their ideas from Hegel. And so it's this genealogy of ideas where, by coming after someone and by reading them, you are the same as them. So, he's tilted at people on the kind of like new right by saying, you read Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt was a member of a certain mid-century regime. Therefore, you are the same as him. And therefore, you are woke. Whereas similarly, right, he would say, Kamala Harris's dad was a Marxist, which means he's basically a Soviet communist, which means that Kamala Harris is basically a member of, the NKVD. And look, I don't particularly like any of those people involved, but Kamala Harris is not a Marxist, right? She's just an extraordinarily dumb woman. And it's this weird kind of like, I don't even know how you describe the thought process, but it is like an extremely unintelligent way of understanding how ideas work. Because look, I've read Lenin. I don't like Lenin. I don't think he was a good man, but he had some very prescient insights into the way that politics and reality works. Right. You can think of any number of writers, like same thing. Like I think that, someone like, what's the name of that French fascist writer? It's on my book. Whatever. I can't remember. There are any number of, authors who, are detestable, who don't even necessarily have great conclusions, but are worth reading nonetheless. Sorry, Josh, that's been another rant from me. I'm wondering if you can pick up where I left off.
Were you thinking of Celine?
Yeah, I was 100% thinking of Celine. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. By the way,
I want to put Celine in a locker is basically my conclusion from reading his work.
I've never read him, but that phrase Hegelian pantheism is like that would make like a great power metal band name. I feel like that, I could imagine Madison Square Garden. We are Hegelian pantheism. Like that sounds.
Well, I mean, and that's the whole thing. Like he tries to run these phrases every couple months, and they never go anywhere. Were you aware when he accused Southern Baptist conservative R.N. McIntyre of being part of a Catholic theosophist cult?
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah. So anyway, he goes on these weird. He invents secret ethno-religious cabals that secretly control the world. And it's amazing how many he can come up of without thinking of one in particular. But again, I should hold my tongue.
Yeah. Your mind works double overtime when you're really fastidiously trying to ignore something. So I wonder, this is not in the essay, it's just kind of an errant thought listening to you. I wonder if this is like the problems of being, because he has a background in mathematics. So I wonder if this is one of the things where it's like math brain trying to do, liberal arts and there's a sort of like very linear, formulaic, equationary way in which he's thinking where, one proposition follows another, and there's a kind of necessary through line between them. Whereas if you're more of a liberal arts brain, you kind of understand the way things bleed into each other and go in different directions and maybe only absorb one aspect of what came before going into a different direction. It reminds me very much of Karl Popper, who I wrote about in my upcoming book with Antelope Hill Press called Intolerant Interpretations. The Open Society and Its Enemies is basically this 600-700 page treatise of how everything that's wrong is because of Hegel and because of Plato. And you can just linearly trace every particular political issue that has cropped up since 1940 or so, and pin it all on Plato and Hegel. And it's like, this is very motivated reasoning. I don't think it actually works that way. But to your point about how isn't Lindsay himself woke? There's a lot of ways in which his definition and his argumentation really implicates him at least as much as it does someone like you or me. So you said before, like, okay, you want to center your identity group. And I think he said on Twitter recently, woke right is when you center your identity group and you want to organize the state centrally to protect your group against an oppressor. It's like, this guy is constantly going on about the communist takeover of everything and how good classical liberals need to band together to resist the Hegelian, Marxist, Franz Fanonian, Orrin McIntyrean, critical whatever conspiracy. So, okay, well, what do we have there? We have a group identity, classical liberals. We have a oppressor group, communist revolutionaries. And we have this, we're using the state, or maybe not the state, but some kind of centralizing power to get rid of people we don't like. So that's one way. But in the essay, and this came directly out of his mouth from the trigonometry interview, he says woke is coming to a critical consciousness of political structures. Which, again, if you want to talk about really, really, really casting a wide net, if you have a critical consciousness of political structures, what are you saying? Well, you're having an awareness and sort of an interrogating mindset into the environment. I mean, I'm sort of being a little general in my own speech here, but I don't understand how you can claim that it's specifically woke to come to a consciousness of political structures and hierarchies, and then to be this, Dick Tracy of Marxism, uncovering these Marxist cabals and genealogies and hierarchies and critically interrogating them. He is woke.
Well, exactly. And this goes back to at a certain point where, if you've made a category that fits everything in it, right, is it a useful discussion tactic? The answer is no, obviously, very clearly. Now, what I think has been especially made clear by how James Lindsay's acted is, despite all his protestations to the contrary, he is not interested in a discussion, right? He wants to be, kind of like king of the conservative loser pile, right? I mean, look, like when you have, someone saying that Paul Gottfried, quote, isn't a serious scholar. And look, I happen to quite like Paul Gottfried, both on a personal and on an intellectual level. But it's very clear that Paul Gottfried knows his work, right? He's a very, very, talented scholar and studied under, many of the men that, Lindsay has devoted his life to kind of chronicling here, right? And so to say that person isn't, serious scholar isn't worth your time. Well, okay, fair enough. Maybe I'll take your word for it once. But when you're, returning or refusing an offer from Sargon, from, any number of these guys who are basically saying like, hey, let's have a discussion about it. It kind of seems like you're not interested in the so-called marketplace of ideas you're always talking about.
Yeah, he won't talk to Dave Smith. He won't, he recently, I think Patrick Casey wrote for Chronicle magazine, Gottfried's magazine. And in their sparring match, he just flatly refused to engage with the content of the material, which is another part of Lindsay's woke definition, is that they will go to ad hominem. They won't engage with the content of the material, they will immediately go into ad hominem. And so whether it's me, and he's quote tweeted me a few times, you actually messaged it to me. Like I woke up and I was like, wow, look at that. James Lindsay quote tweeted me. Or actually he blocked me and then he screen capped and then did his like stupid celebration dance. You know, he can do this to me.
I just want to say, I seem to be the only person in the world who can't get James Lindsay to block me because I'm not particularly kind to him, and yet I can still see all this stuff.
Yeah, I think Pete and I kind of came to the conclusion. I think you have to logically checkmate him, and that's the only way he'll block you. If you're like cutesy or you insult him, he'll let it fly. But if you checkmate him on his own argument, that's when the block and then the screenshot quote response comes.
Josh, are you familiar with the Russian concept of stuob?
I'm not.
So it's a great term, right, for this sort of like malicious overcompliance, right? Where it's like, you know, you're being forced to do something, you know, you don't believe in. So you go so far with it to make it a farce, right? You go over the top to show how ridiculous it is.
Right.
All I'm saying is it's a great way to have a lot of fun on the internet, and I'll leave it at that.
You just gave me the decoder ring to like 70% of your tweets. Now
100%.
Your timeline now makes sense to me. So what was I saying before? Yeah. So he whether it's me when he quote tweets me and just calls me a retard, or when he quote tweets Keith Woods and calls him a twink, or when in his response with Patrick Casey and says something like, "You are beneath me." I don't remember the exact phrase that he used. It might have even been something like, "You're not worth it." It's like, what is the purpose of this then? What are you really trying to demonstrate? And he has this B team of very small, very sycophantic accounts who will all then pile in and lavish him with praise, and even go after people in his replies. And so he's running his own little weird cult of 90s liberalism. And it just, to go back to a phrase I used earlier in this conversation, you know, it doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't have to be coherent. And Lindsay doesn't have to play by the rules he establishes because it's regime polemics. The point of regime polemics is to fortify the establishment with a sort of maximally superficial analysis. Now, in the case of Lindsay, and this is kind of what I think is actually interesting about his whole little episode here, is if you want to compare him to previous iterations of people who do I'm debunking the right wing, he's actually gotten the most in the weeds with our philosophy. In that trigonometry segment, he's explicitly naming, you know, Buckley and National Review as this fake conservatism. He is explicitly naming the emergence of the post-war consensus for the purposes of never again. Like, he's saying these phrases. He's giving us, or he's giving his audience, basically the elevator pitch of our worldview. And he's doing it in this in this highly detailed academic way where he's not throwing any shade or doing any hyperbole or fudging the details or the finer edges of our argument. He's just simply presenting it. And he says, okay, they believe in this post-war consensus. They believe in this fake conservatism that was erected to shut out the real conservatives. They read Carl Schmitt, Julius Evola, and James Burnham. They believe that white Christian men are the most oppressed group of men, and they're organizing to do something about it. And it's like, if you're listening to him, at least, you know, you and me, if we're listening to him, it's like, yep, check. Oh, good. If we're grading, you know, like the James Lindsay book report on the radical right, it's like, oh, very good. Check mark, gold star, A+. And then he gets to the very end and the smear comes at the very end. And it's just, so that's what they believe. And it's woke. Okay, Let's move on to the next thing. So it's funny to me that he is much more explicitly presenting our point of view to his audience and then appending it with this smear, which to me makes the smear actually very ineffective. And it makes everything that came before, like he's like, I could retire, you and me, we can retire practically because he's done our job to, disseminating our message to the trigonometry audience of like however many million people, or wherever he's going doing his song and dance. It's like he's presenting everything we believe about as accurately as you can possibly get. And then he turns around and says, yeah, but it's like woke and stupid. So don't worry about it too much. I mean, that kind of seems to me to be like the fatal issue at play. Because he's doing our job for us.
Yeah, to me, I think you're right. In a big picture sense, I think it's no accident that this debate really heats up after the Trump victory in November, because I think that a lot of the kind of more normie conservative influencers are really feeling pressure to their right, from any number of people. And so I think that for someone who is really very close to a full-on Reddit progressive, right, who is an avowed atheist, a sort of fedora tipper archetype, he probably realizes that he is coming up to the sort of allowable limit of the right wing, right? Obviously, there's Conservative Inc., but and he certainly has funding for many of those things, but he's branded himself as not aligned with that. And so I think that a lot of this is basically trying to keep his place in the market. And the moment that it seemed like, Trump was going to be in office, all of a sudden it became a giant circular firing squad and people started gunning for other people's part of the pie. And so I think you're both right that he's doing a very good job of, explaining our arguments. But also, I think that, kind of like at the end of Starship Troopers, right? It's like, it's afraid, and then everyone cheers.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. I don't know that I don't want to beat a dead horse here. Like, what's that line from The Simpsons? Stop eating. He's already dead. Like, that's kind of how I feel about James Lindsay. But it feels like 2016. There's elements of it that feel like 2016 all over again. Like when Hillary Clinton name dropping the alt-right and InfoWars on the public stage, on the domestic stage, or when the SJW thing pivoted to become a way of discrediting Trump people. Similar kind of thing, although I guess compared to what you just said now, pressure from the right, hence the James Lindsay is a little bit different, obviously, from the left feeling the pressure of an impending Trump victory and then sort of fumbling the ball. But it is this sort of, to quote George Lucas, history rhymes, and we are kind of dealing with this same type of, basically the same battle, but on a new battleground. And that really does, I guess, highlight, for people maybe who are very cynical or pessimistic about the Trump victory and where this country is going over the next few years, it really does, in my mind, cement how the parameters of this whole conflict are actually much different. And the fact that this guy is getting so much flack, like you said earlier, everywhere he goes, he's just getting ratioed and pilloried by people, to the point where I think even Konstantin Kisin has effectively disavowed the woke right label. Like within a week or 10 days of that appearance, he's like, actually, you know what? This isn't working out for me. Count me out. Let's come up with a different phrase. I think he's calling us the barbarian right or something, which is kind of cool, actually, but, not really snappy. What were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to say, and we've danced around this at several points, and I am for the sake of the platform, right, going to have to be circumspect in how we talk about this. But I also think a large part of this is basically whatever you do, don't stop supporting a certain foreign interest, right? That's very close to it. It's interesting that, Lindsay has been going after Candace Owens. And look, I can't blame him. I think Candace Owens is, in addition to being disinteresting, not particularly intelligent. But what's interesting is that, when he goes after her, he says all these nasty things about her, and it's like, and she's encouraging dangerous anti-Israeli rhetoric and says mean things about America. It's like, that's a weird thing to say first, right? As an American patriot. And really, I think that's a large part of this, right? Given possible sources of funding, right? That, just like we saw with the neocons, certain concessions to the right can be made. But the one thing that will no backsliding is ever allowed on is support for the nation of Israel.
Yeah, especially in light of what happened in Syria. Not to go too much into a digression and being as circumspect as you were, about a year and 2 months ago, I think a lot of people were predicting probably the collapse of this shining democracy in the Middle East, sort of this kind of what they've really done it now moment. And in fact, what's happened over the last year is just kind of one consecutive victory after another, to such a degree that it's starting to look like there is maybe going to be a new kind of political order in that part of the world. And the consequences of that, I'm not entirely sure what they're going to be for Trump's next term, or just in general, the global political climate. So despite this massive success in winning, there still is this tremendous scrutiny, probably more scrutiny than there's ever been. And yeah, I don't watch Candace Owens' show, and I think she tends to get the facts wrong more often than she gets them right. But there's a certain virtue, I guess I'm of two minds of it. On the one hand, it's great that such a big spotlight is being put on such a delicate issue. But because it's a delicate issue, you have to really have like a surgeon's fingers to handle it. And if you're like a fat-fingered, greasy idiot, then you're not really helping all that much. Nonetheless, it's still keeping this ongoing criticism going. Pardon my redundancy. So that's obviously motivating someone like James Lindsay. I think for the most part, he does a good job of not saying the quiet part out loud. But like you said, yeah, every once in a while you get this. These queer statements like, yeah, and then also America, but hey, the first thing's really important.
Well, actually, I have a very specific citation for this. Do you remember Coach Red Pill, Gonzalo Lira?
R.I.P. Yes.
Yeah, again, sadly killed, of course. But he did an interview with Lindsay like 2 or 3 years ago. It's quite a while ago, on one of his channels. And what's interesting about that, it's in the like 20 to 40 minute range. Is Lindsay is actually very, very open about his intentions. And basically what he says is, we need to make sure that everyone blames these new these new left thinkers as communists and not as one of their other identifiers, and basically goes on to say that is his mission, that he needs to head off certain ideas about certain groups at the pass. And so you can find that at home, guys, talking to you, the audience, right, pretty easily. It's still up on YouTube. It's worth your time. A lot of it's just kind of normal Lindsay dribble, but he does say very explicitly what he is going about. And so to me, after having seen that, it's hard for me to believe that he is simply, exclusively a grifter. That's certainly part of it. But I think that there's a very deliberate mission in this as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. That in general seems to be the trend of Con Inc. and these kind of peripheral tendrils of the system, which is we really, really, really need to lock down this anti-Israel sentiment, like we really need to. And the question, I guess, remains to be seen is whether that's going to work or not. Just looking at a James Lindsay, like he's so catastrophically disastrous at defending them. Like he's opening more vectors for attack than there were previously. And anyone who tries to do this, especially in the Christian nationalism scene in general, I don't know if you follow the Stone Choir guys.
I don't. I know that, and it's nothing against them because I know that Woes in particular is always a big booster of my stuff. But I'm familiar with who they are.
Yeah, and they're on this similar trajectory of exposing all of these, Christian or pseudo-Christian diet Christ types who seem to be singularly animated by a desire to protect the good name of the shining democracy in the Middle East. So I don't see it working, but a lot of things have happened, especially in the last week or two, that I didn't anticipate. But it's interesting to watch, and it makes for good fodder for my Substack. I guess at the end of the day, like it's you have to thank these people because it's really, just speaking for myself, their intense focus on this issue is really helping people like me generate a better understanding of what's going on.
Well, and I'm going to echo your sentiments because, like I said before we started rolling, I've been following James Lindsay for a long time. I find him personally very amusing. And so the fact that his rate of posting absolute insanity and his ability to pick fights with people I actually like, right? Because when James Lindsay's saying something stupid about someone I also hate, it's like, let him fight, But when it's like someone I actually know about, I'm like, well, you not only are, creating this kind of crazy conspiracy theory about, Catholic theosophists trying to summon the Archangel Michael, and institute, the next stage of human evolution, like it's the end of Evangelion or something. It's completely and totally insane, but it's also great entertainment. But also, Lindsay, that line about like, small minds discuss people. Well, Lindsay is kind of emblematic of, a whole system of thought, which is really a cope from the regime, right? It is a cope from the losing side of American politics, right? The Republican Party, an attempt to, ape the kind of like social mores of the Democratic Party in the 90s. And it's a losing strategy. And it needs to be very plainly shown to be a losing strategy because we've been running modified versions for my entire life, your entire life, our parents' entire lives, right? Of basically trying to, become the Democrats of yesteryear. And, Lindsay has gotten into a very powerful place, right? He speaks on podcasts listened to by millions of people. There are, dozens of pastors and priests from, all denominations who go hear him at talks. He's a very influential guy, and he's peddling absolute nonsense.
It's very disingenuous too. One of the things that I actually really maybe find the most repugnant about him, not to get too mean, because we've been, I think, pretty civil this whole time. Now, I'm not the best Christian in the world, but it really riles me up when somebody who's like an avowed denier of the faith then pivots to using biblical argumentation. I mean, it's the meme, like the age-old meme of like, well, I don't believe this, obviously, but I think you should obviously be browbeaten and forced to adhere to your rules, right? Like, you're not a Christian, dude. You don't believe in this. Your catalog of publications is basically you mocking people for having a genuine faith in Christ. And here you are, fast forward a couple of years later, because it's advantageous for you. Because now, back then, your job was to browbeat these people. Now your job is to corral them like a sheep herder or something and drive them in a new direction. Before you were trying to displace them entirely. Now you want to bunch them up and fold them in your back pocket. It really, really drives me crazy that a big part of his angle on this, regime polemics, whether it's anti-woke right or pro-Israel or whatever the case is browbeating Christians into accepting his worldview on Christian terms. I just think it's repugnant. I don't really have much more to say on that other than I really find it revolting.
Yeah, and I've definitely seen exactly that as well, right? Again, because the person I'm obliquely referring to is hyper litigious. I won't mention who, but Lindsay has really become, it seems to be deliberately, inserted into religious circles. And, obviously I don't view him as an honest actor, but, to the religious leaders who were, kind of aiding and abetting him, it's hard for me not to look at that and see a wolf in sheep's clothing. And I will leave it at that. So, Josh, we are fast coming up on time. I said a number of things that I probably shouldn't have for the sake of my YouTube channel. But yeah, man, if people want to find more of you and your work, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, I appreciate that, the invitation. Love talking to you. You're a great guy. Find me on Substack, jneal.substack.com. Find me on Twitter, still jneal. You can find my books at imperiumpress.org. They're everywhere else too, but we really would appreciate if you went over to Imperium Press, because a lot of these other platforms take large percentages of the book sales, like Amazon takes large percentages of the book sales. So if you like what you've heard, if you're interested in me, or you just want to support an independent business, head over to imperiumpress.org, pick up a copy of American Extremist or Understanding Conspiracy Theories, and look out sometime Q1 of 2025. My new book, Intolerant Interpretations, will be out, so you can check that out.
Well, I am really looking forward to reading that. Obviously, I highly recommend all your old work. I got a lot from it. As far as my stuff, The Jay Burden Show is available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. If you want to support us, you can obviously do that directly with the crypto links down in the description, or you can check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. And Josh, Neal, you've actually you've rolled with me before. You're familiar with my level of physical conditioning, and I owe that all to JD at Axios. So it's just a ringing endorsement. I'll leave it at that. But again, man, thank you so much for coming on. And to everyone at home, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.